If the United States were to relax its restrictions on what Ukraine can do with the weapons supplied to it, that would fit the pattern of previous US behavior, where there's dogged resistance to allowing Ukraine to do something or to supplying the weapons system in the first place, and then that is eventually, finally overcome. There's also the added dimension, of course, on the block on the UK and France using their own long-range missiles, or rather Ukraine using the ones supplied by the UK and France, where it may be that the media suggestions we're seeing that the UK is asking for permission for these to be used is accurate, and that may be an outcome of this conversation that we've seen in Kyiv this week between Blinken, Lamy, and Zelensky. There's one reliable response from the Kremlin every time something happens which takes them by surprise or upsets them, and that is to attempt to increase the amount of death and destruction that's delivered against Ukraine's most vulnerable citizens, stepping up the missile and drone strikes against hospitals, against shopping centers, against the people who cannot defend themselves. That is almost a given whenever anything happens that the Kremlin doesn't like. But in terms of the more serious escalation, the kind of repercussions that the United States is most concerned about, again and again we've seen that that does not actually come to pass. There's no suggestion at the moment that the relaxation of these restrictions would be the final straw that leads the Kremlin to do something suicidal after so many different supposed red lines have already been crossed. The threats of nuclear escalation are the ones which figure most prominently in these concerns about escalation. And yes, there's no reason to think that Russia would trade a problem which is unpleasant but survivable for something which could actually be existential and lead to the suicide of the state, like launching a nuclear weapon. But of course, there are other ways in which Russia can escalate. One of them is the repercussions for Ukraine itself, where Russia steps up its strikes in response to unpleasant developments that it doesn't like visited on itself. The other, of course, is the ongoing campaigns of sabotage and reconnaissance across Europe and in the UK as well, apparently preparing for conflict directly with NATO itself. There are different ways in which Russia can attempt to make life unpleasant for the countries it sees as its adversaries, and not all of them are necessarily tied up with nuclear escalation. We've seen already a spike in the number of sabotage attacks that have been carried out across Europe. Now, those, of course, are pinpricks when compared to the scale of the conflict in Ukraine or what Russia could do if it tried to unleash its forces against Europe as a whole. Nevertheless, they do impose costs. They do make life difficult. They consume a vast amount of the energy of European security, counterintelligence, law enforcement agencies. And, of course, most importantly for Russia, they sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So we shouldn't be surprised if that uptick in activity by Russia, this covert action that they're carrying out by recruiting proxies across the continent and in the UK, shouldn't continue. We've seen a wide range of different types of activity against European countries. Some of it is direct attacks, like, for example, the arson attacks that are carried out against sometimes seemingly random targets, like a warehouse in East London, an IKEA in Eastern Europe. Other times, it's reconnaissance. It's looking for how Russia could do damage in the future. It's mapping out energy infrastructure, looking at critical national infrastructure, looking at emergency preparedness across all of these countries. But most of all, it's looking at logistics links across Europe, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, like Poland and the Czech Republic. The rail links that would be essential for bringing reinforcements to the Eastern Front in the event of a broader conflict in Eastern Europe have been a particular target for Russia's security and intelligence services. It's very unlikely that Russia is going to be at all surprised if there is a relaxation on the restrictions of use of long-range missiles. After all, this move has been telegraphed for so very long, and we've today had the Kremlin spokesman saying that the decision has already been taken. So it would be astonishing if Russia were not preparing for this to be the case. Now, some of the downsides, supposedly, of allowing Ukraine to do this actually sound like positives if you look at them from a Ukrainian point of view. The United States has said that there's no point in allowing Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia because Russia will just move those assets that Ukraine wants to strike at further away. But that in itself sounds like a positive outcome for doing this. If unpleasant things happen to one or another of the coalition in response to them doing something for which repercussions have been threatened, then that is something for them to consider the next time they're considering doing something escalatory, as opposed to the current situation where they plainly haven't been deterred from doing this by the threats of consequences from the West. It's a consistent challenge for the current US administration, doing whatever they can for Ukraine and cementing that in place so that if possible, it can't be reversed by the next administration to come in, which may be more inclined to try to force Ukraine to surrender to Russia. But of course, if we do have a Trump presidency after November, it's not just Ukraine that's in trouble, it's all of us, given his clearly signaled reluctance to meet American commitments when it comes to the defense of Europe. The US legislature has passed a law to prevent the US president from unilaterally withdrawing from NATO, but he doesn't have to in order to neutralize everything that NATO does to protect its easternmost members. All you need to do if you are the head of state of one of the countries within NATO is simply instruct your armed forces not to cooperate and withdraw your cooperation from the headquarters, and you are effectively withdrawing even if it's not on paper. Ukraine depends not just on one-off deliveries of US aid, but on the enormous quantity that is an ongoing flow from the United States to keep Ukraine afloat. If that flow is interrupted, if the US steps on the hose and makes sure that it does not arrive at the front line where it's needed in Ukraine, we've already seen the consequences of that in the early part of this year, where ammunition starvation and the interruption of vital supplies led to lives and territory being lost in Ukraine. If that goes on for a longer period with more determination from a US administration to cut off that aid, then Ukraine is in serious trouble. But then so are the rest of us, because that's the point at which Russia starts looking around for its next target. We can't tell what Putin's state of mind is because we don't know precisely what information is reaching him. There are consistent indications that the news that is reaching him is filtered and it's only the good bits that get through. That is extremely dangerous because it gives him a completely misinformed appreciation of what the real situation is. Exactly the same as we saw in February 2022 when Russia launched its assault on Ukraine, expecting a completely different outcome from what they found there. The danger is that Putin could once again convince himself that the time is right to launch another attack, only this time against a NATO nation. Throughout the whole of this conflict, Ukraine has looked for ways to limit the damage that is being inflicted on it from safe zones in Russian territory. We've seen that over and over again, and now Ukraine needs to extend the area that it can actually interdict Russian operations in so that it cannot launch not only military offensives, but also these ongoing campaigns against Ukrainian civilians and against national infrastructure.
Куда?